you all for coming. I'm Richard Abramenko, Professor of Political Science and Integrated Liberal Studies here at the University of Wisconsin. And this is, I believe, our installment of our lecture series, Conservative Political Thought. And today, I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker today is Rachel Liu, who is a writer based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her work has appeared in many places, too numerous to mention here, but most notably for me in The Week, America Magazine, National Review, The American Conservative, the latest one, National Review.
I also do a monthly column for Law and Liberty. So
Yes, she has a PhD in philosophy from Cornell University and is a Robert Novak Journalism Fellow. She lives in Minneapolis with her husband and 5 sons on a lake. She tells me freezes and they get to skate on. She is the envy of all of us. Please welcome to Madison, Dr. Rachel Liu.
thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm embarrassed, really, that I have lived in the Twin Cities for like 15 years, and I've never been on your campus before. But it's gorgeous. The way you have like this whole shoreline going up, it's beautiful. And I obviously came on exactly the right day with all of the trees suddenly coming out in bloom and so forth. So really a pleasure to be here today. So I have this lovely sort of scholarly seeming title, Nature, Sex, and Question of Womanhood. We're going to be talking some about feminism today, but especially this is of course a course on conservative ideas. So you might say we're going to talk about conservative feminism, which might prompt the question, are conservatives feminists? I thought conservatives didn't like feminism that much. Maybe what you have among conservatives is anti-feminism. And actually that would be is a fair question. And a lot of people on the right who have had ideas about women have described themselves as anti-feminist. So we're going to talk about that over the course of the lecture. Feminism, anti-feminism, how do conservatives think about these questions? Though if I were being cute, I could call this course or call this lecture How I Finally Consented to Be Called a Feminist or something like that. I spent most of my life as a writer steadfastly refusing to say whether I'm a feminist or an anti-feminist or whatever. I always just said, you can just read what I write about these questions and you decide. If you think I'm a feminist, that's fine. If you think I'm an anti-feminist, that's fine. I'm not going to fight you either way. But there are reasons I'll get to at the end why now people in print seem to be calling me a feminist in certain circles. And I'm like, all right. Sometimes you have to just bow to the development of the conversation. But we'll get to that at the end. So here is the way that the lecture is going to sort of be shaped. So first we're going to talk about, in broad terms, why is the question of womanhood and the status of women in society so difficult for conservatives? We're going to think in broad terms about why these questions are hard. I think are hard in general, right? But we're going to look at this from a sort of conservative point of view. The second point, we're going to do this very brief flyby tour of some of the important issues that have shaped these American debates about women. Very brief flyby tour. The readings that I assigned to you, I hope give you a little bit of the flavor of how conservatives in different eras have thought about some of these questions. So that can give you a little bit more nuance that I'm going to be able to give you. Obviously, in the course of this lecture, I can't give you this whole historical tour of conservative ideas about women, but we can at least flag some of the questions that people ask. And then finally, I want to talk about, really, there's kind of a war, maybe war is too strong, but these questions about women have sort of really flared up on the right recently, and you have a kind of dialectic kind of battle going on among right-leaning people about feminism and questions relating to women. So for the final segment, I'm going to give you a little bit of a feel for what that looks like right now. It's kind of interesting to see where the thing is going. I will broadcast in advance, I am not an impartial party in this. I am kind of one of the combatants of this war, which is also a little strange. I didn't really sometimes this happens when you're a public writer, right? You're not necessarily looking to get into some particular debate, but then people come to you and say, don't you think X? You're like, sure, I think X. Well, could pay you money to write X and put you okay, yeah, I mean, sure. And then next thing you know, then you're in a war. So we'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so for purposes of the class, you have to kind of put this out here just to kind of set the stage. For the purposes of this lecture, we're going to define a woman as an adult human being with the sort of body capable of gestating and bearing a child. And a man as an adult human being with the sort of body that is capable of fathering a child. I feel like we just have to set that out up front so we can clear up possible confusions about what we're talking about right now. We're not going to debate this definition. Obviously, in some contexts you would, but this is a lecture on conservative ideas, and on the right, people aren't really going to mostly have problems with this definition. So this is going to kind of set up our thing. And as I note here, there are occasions when it's difficult for a given individual to tell whether they're a man or a woman, but those are kind of unusual. Most people can classify themselves using that definition. So here are some things. This is just a laundry list. So I'm giving this to set up this question, or rather this exploration of the challenges that conservatives tend to confront in thinking about questions relating to women. A laundry list of things that conservatives tend to value. No particular order stuff. And this is near the end of your class, right? So you've surely talked about many of these things. I've listened to some of the lectures. You've talked about many of these things already. So human persons, right? David Walsh already gave you a whole lecture on this. Conservatives value human persons, see them as intrinsically precious. A rational human nature, right? This is a core Aristotelian idea that human beings have a rational nature, and living in accord with that rational nature is something we should try to do, right? We should try to live good lives informed by rational decisions, making rational decisions. Civil society, specifically as built by participating citizens. So this is kind of a Tocquevillian idea, maybe, or a Burkean idea, right? That we want civil society to be built up by the members of it participating in different ways. And we really want that to be kind of what defines us as a people. But also, as Americans, we value our constitutional order as the basis for liberty. Nature is something conservatives value a lot, but understood in a kind of a deep way, right? Not just trees and grass, but sort of the types of things that they are. We want to understand what kind of a thing each thing other is and respect that intrinsic. Nature is really the word. You respect the intrinsic nature, respect what things really are. But we especially care about the organic ordering of things like bodies, families, communities, things that involve human beings. We care very much about how they are organically ordered, and we want to respect that natural order. Tradition. Things are handed down from previous generations. We don't always just inherit those exactly as we receive them, but we have this kind of intrinsic respect for tradition, right? Conservatives do. We think, the way things have been done for a long time probably contains a lot of wisdom that we don't fully understand. So we're going to tend to at least value and respect that, not just sort of jettison it for no particular reason. And finally, moral responsibility. Maybe I should have put this one up with the rational human nature, but conservatives tend to have a strong sense that we want people to accept the consequences of what they do or have a clear understanding of what follows from their actions. So again, these are all just kind of listed there. Why do I give you this laundry list? Because when we start looking at questions of women, what we're going to find is that there are tensions between different things that conservatives value that are going to arise when we're trying to decide what space women should occupy in society, right? There are different ways that we could handle social questions relating to women, and they're not all going to preserve every one of these goods to the same degree. And that's one of the reasons why these questions become hard, right? There are different things that we value that kind of come into tension when we start thinking about questions relating to women. But let's look at these are sort of points of widespread agreement among conservatives. That doesn't mean nobody in any way conservative wouldn't agree, but they tend to be relatively consensus positions. So most conservatives are concerned about the ethics of abortion. Why? Because we think that unborn persons have intrinsic value, right? So that tends to be a pretty widespread position among conservatives. We think that women are persons with rights, right? Women are clearly persons, and that means that they have intrinsic dignity, and that needs to be respected. Also a rational nature, and that's going to become pretty important. We tend to think that marriage and family life are good for individuals and for society. We tend to think that marriage and the natal family are a natural organic ordering of persons, and one that we want to respect, and one that we would like to preserve as a cornerstone of society. We tend to think, also in keeping with respecting the natures of things, that it may be okay for men and women to play different roles in the family or in society, as long as those differences reflect some kind of real difference between men and women or different life choices that they make. We tend to say men and women do seem to be different in certain ways. And if they're playing different roles in the family or in society that reflect actual differences, that might be fine. We don't necessarily want to make them as similar or as equal as possible if there are real differences that should be noticed and respected. And finally, we tend to think, again, I'm speaking in very broad terms here. There's a lot of points that we could clarify further, but we tend to think that traditional views about sexual morals or sexual ethics contain a lot of truth and wisdom. Again, that doesn't mean that all traditions are right in every single particular, but we tend to have some level of deference to tradition on questions relating to sex and sexual morals. Okay, so those are kind of reasonable consensus positions. But then when you go beyond that, things start to get thornier, and there's a lot of things that we don't agree about or that we struggle to figure out how we should handle hard questions that arise in society. So there's some broad picture ways in which conservatives end up arguing among themselves about the best way to realize goods and objectives that they broadly share. How do we value both mothers and their children, born and unborn children? How do we balance out all the different needs of all these different people? How can we acknowledge nature, correct? We've said conservatives like nature, they want to recognize things for what they are, but at the same time, individuals are also distinct, right? They're not just members of classes. Individuals have all kinds of distinctions among themselves. So when we're looking at both laws and social norms, how can we robustly recognize that nature matters, but also recognize that individual persons will have different personalities and differences among them that need to be recognized as well? How do we balance moral responsibility is the danger of exploiting? I'm not going to say too much about that one here because we'll say a lot more about that soon. How do we respect tradition while recognizing that times change? Perpetual problem for conservatives, but definitely one that arises when it comes to questions relating to women. And then how do we support family life in general, but without unduly limiting opportunity for particular people, and especially women, right? So how can we support family life, but also ensure that individuals have opportunities themselves? Okay, so those are just big picture questions. Now I'm going to sort of flesh those out a little bit more by giving you some hypothetical arguments that we could consider. So I had these in quotes when I first made this slide, and then I thought, well, everybody's going to want to know who I'm quoting. I wrote it, but it's a hypothetical argument, right? I'm not advancing this as a position. I'm saying here's a hypothetical position that I think broadly resembles arguments that people have made, but I'm just advancing this as a hypothetical. In most historical societies, women have not been fully engaged in the public sphere, or maybe even full-fledged citizens at all, right? There's a strong historical precedent for women being less than full-fledged citizens. It's a little bit complicated. This makes sense because the biological vulnerabilities of women and the demands of childbearing make it difficult and sometimes unsafe for women to shoulder all the rights and duties of citizenship. Note when we make this claim that in many societies, military service was one of the core requirements of citizenship, right? Say, well, you don't want pregnant women serving in the military. That doesn't make sense. So it's not going to be good for women to be full-fledged citizens. Also, healthy families need domestic support and labor. So maybe the best way to promote family life and protect women and young children is by treating women as a domestically oriented protected class, so something less than full-fledged citizens. To say that they're not full-fledged citizens obviously doesn't mean they don't have any rights, right? Usually they have some kind of rights in a society where they're not full-fledged citizens, but maybe mediated to some extent through male family members, right? You can't just summarily murder them. No society thinks that's fine, but they can't necessarily exercise all of the rights of full-fledged citizens. one hypothetical argument. Here's a second hypothetical argument. Women are rational human beings with an obvious capacity for civic participation. It would be unreasonable, and here in the United States, contrary to our constitutional principles, to deny them full citizenship with all the rights and freedoms that apply merely on the basis of biology. Also, in a developed society, we should want to capture women's talents and energies for the good of society as a whole. Those can include things relating to the domestic sphere, but they clearly aren't limited to that, right? So we should want to capture the full range of women's talents. Domestic labor and caretaking are important, but we should leave it to individual families to decide how to distribute those. Okay, so two hypothetical arguments that I think bear broad resemblance to things that people have argued. And I called this section the puzzle of womanhood because, you know, these arguments, you know, some of the things that I said there might have offended you, but I think you at least have to say each of them captures some of the things that conservatives value reasonably well, but may struggle to capture other goods that conservatives value, right? So argument one, it robustly acknowledges sexual differences between sexes. And it places a high value on family life and the preservation of the integrity of the family. But it struggles to fully acknowledge women's rational potential and capacity for citizenship. That might be. Argument two does much more robustly recognize women's rational potential and capacity for citizenship, but may not supply enough space for supporting marriage and family life, and that may in turn end up sort of foisting heavy burdens on particular individuals who are often women. So that's another point that we're going to look at soon. And underlying all of this are sort of hard questions about sex and pregnancy and moral responsibility that really could be discussed at much greater length in their own right. Conservatives want to acknowledge that sex here, the sexual act is morally significant, right? That has significant consequences that responsible adults should accept. But the fact that sex imposes asymmetrical burdens on men and women raises hard questions about personal choice and justice. That is to say, women can become pregnant, men cannot become pregnant. So the act itself is morally significant, but the burdens that can follow from that don't naturally distribute themselves equally across the sexes. So that raises hard questions, right, about justice and how we should order society in order to properly respond to that natural fact. And finally, a child is extremely important. We care about the context in which people enter the world. We want the world somehow to be set up so that children enter it in some optimal circumstance. But what does that mean for sexual norms and for laws and for women? Okay, so moving into my second section here. I'm just gonna have a few slides that highlight big picture issues that conservatives have debated, not just conservatives. I will reference broader conversations with the American public as a whole and feminism as a whole, because of course, in some cases, you end up having internal conservative debates. That's really kind of what we have right now, that I'm going to talk about at the end. But obviously, in other cases, you have debates between people on the right and people on the left about questions relating to women. So I will reference those two. So in the late 19th century, okay, so the question of women in the workforce, this has been a very controversial subject, and in some ways it still is, right? I mean, still thinking about how women are treated in the workforce and what should they be doing there. In the late 19th century, there were very interesting debates about whether women should get special labor protection. So relatively early, actually, in the conversation about labor laws generally, right? So you have a lot of conversations about labor just in general. Should you have minimum wages and should you have maximum work hours and what can you do to protect workers? There were conversations about whether there should be special protective laws specifically for women. And it was actually really interesting to see this debate because we would recognize many of the points today, the same kinds of questions that recur. One group of people is basically saying, we have to have special protections for women. They have particular vulnerabilities. They can't be on their feet for 15 hours a day. Sometimes they get pregnant. We can't have them working under these inhumane conditions. They need special protections. And other people are saying, if we create special protections for women, employers won't want to hire them. And women who want to work under a whole range of circumstances or in a range of jobs won't be able to do it. Don't lose that opportunity because we've done all of these things specifically to patronize women. And so, so this goes all the way back into the 19th century, right? That people are having these arguments. World War II comes, of course, and blitzing through time. World War II comes and women actually, you know, Rosie the Riveter, right? Women end up working in factories and doing all kinds of things that it was uncommon for them to do. And then in the post, so there wasn't really necessarily, well, I don't know, actually, there probably were some arguments about it, but I think mostly people were just really interested in winning the war. So they just kind of did what they had to do. But then after World War II, then you have all of these debates about, okay, so women did all these jobs. Do they keep doing jobs like that? Now that the men have come home from war, do we want them to go back to the kitchen and the men can do the jobs now? What do we want to do here? So that became an issue. And to some extent, the reading from Midge Decter that I gave you is in that kind of era, right? Where you have a conservative thinker that's kind of going through a lot of the considerations that she sees that we should be working through and deciding what role we should play. Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique comes out where she suggests that women hate housewifery, they're super bored, educated women are sitting around feeling unfulfilled. And that, of course, transforms the conversation in many ways. You have in the 70s, court cases, should employers be able to, Ida Phillips versus the Martin Mariota Company, I think is the court case where they said a company could not refuse to hire a woman because she had young children. So that constitutes discrimination. You can't have a company policy that you won't hire mothers of young children. Okay. And then I think in recent years, we haven't really had as many sort of landmark legislative or sort of black and white social questions. In our time, not very many people are arguing that, you know, all women need to get teachers. That's not really a very live position now. But we do have a lot of arguments about whether caregivers are adequately respected. We have ongoing conversations about pay gaps, employment discrimination, Me Too, sexual harassment, and then about the trade-offs between supporting domestic women and facilitating opportunity. On the right, we have those conversations. Okay. Sex positivity and sexual norms. I'll go through these kind of quickly, but in general, do social norms relating to decency and modesty stifle women, or do they reinforce their comfort and dignity? And you really have a lot of questions that kind of come out of this. And again, we're looking at these sort of trade-offs between trying to acknowledge and accommodate certain vulnerabilities or the potential for women to be victims of predation versus concerns about patronizing them or limiting their opportunities and freedoms too much. And there can be a lot of difficult questions. Is it good to have sort of special rules about how men treat women, so chivalry or gentlemanly behavior? Is that a good thing? Or does that patronize women and reinforce offensive double standards? Maybe if you insist that the women have to be treated in special ways, that's going to make it hard for them to get ahead at work. You know, the Mike Pence rule, if we say, well, you know, you can't have women sitting at a table with men, does that reinforce her comfort, or does that just mean she can't get the job? What about pornography and sexual harassment? Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody thinks that these are good, but in general, people are going to come out and think that these are wonderful things, but how aggressively should they be regulated? What should we do things about these, or is this sort of part of the world? These things happen sometimes. So just in general, there can be trade-offs between protecting women and particularly protecting them from male aggression and respecting their freedom and individual agency. And finally, abortion. Abortion is a fascinating issue because, so after the Civil War, there was actually, by at least the standards of the time, a sort of significant uptick in abortions. We think there's a whole conversation about why we even believe that, because of course it wasn't legal at the time, so they didn't have official statistics. But the feminists of that era, sort of the proto-suffragettes, saw abortion as a great evil. They largely saw this as a sign of how wrong our country had gone in its treatment of women and in the status of women. They formed a lot of organizations to try to support pregnant women, also to hold men accountable for the children that they fathered. And that was actually, to a great extent, the focus of first wave feminists or suffragists. But after that, so in the 1910s, Margaret Sanger and the eugenics movement take up the cause of birth control and abortion that they present as a pro-woman cause, right? Relieving women of the burdens of pregnancy and childbearing. And that kind of continues on. The pro-life movement has some foundations in that period, mostly from Catholics across those decades. But in the 1960s, then the second wave feminists take up those causes more aggressively. Of course, in 1973, Roe versus Wade legalizes abortion in all 50 states. And it was really at that point that Protestant groups now sort of joined the Catholics in opposing abortion, and pro-life movement became a major political force. And the pro-life movement, I gave you a reading on this as well, but I think it was pretty characteristic of how pro-life movement of sort of the 80s and 90s, the later 20th century, thought about these kinds of questions. They really believed that, much like the early feminists of the, well, feminists of the late 19th century, suffragettes, that abortion was very harmful to women and to children, and that a country in which abortion was sort of conveniently offered as a way of relieving women of burdens often ended up just abandoning women when they had significant needs. So abortion raises some familiar questions about protection versus agency, but of course with much stronger concerns about moral responsibility for the woman, but also for other people in her general orbit, and of course about the intrinsic value of the child. None of these other issues are quite as right? Nobody really thinks that, you know, the question of whether or not we have pornographic magazines or, well, not nobody, I shouldn't say that, but I mean, people in general don't believe that the question of sexual harassment or pornography or whether women are wearing modest clothes are as important as the life of a child, right? I mean, the abortion clearly has a higher level. All right, so like I say, I've lured through that kind of quickly because I want to make sure we have time for this final segment, because I think it might be one of the more fun ones. Although, as I was, well, there's a reading I sort of regretted not giving you. We'll get a little bit of it in a second. So we have kind of a new feminist, anti-feminist debate, dialectic on the political right at the moment. And it's kind of interesting to think about why today's anti-feminists, and they very much they call themselves anti-feminists. They present themselves as anti-feminists. So I'm not smearing them or anything when I refer to them that way. One of the things about today's anti-feminists on the right is they're really not fighting very much with people on the left. They're mostly fighting with other people on the right. It's mostly a sort of internal conservative battle, not really a left-right battle at the moment. Obviously, these things can always change. But just as by way of setting that up, I think one of the reasons for that, so the 21st century has seen a few sort of feminist moments. The Obama administration's contraceptive mandate. I guess most of you are pretty young, because you probably don't have active memories of this all being controversial. But yeah, so in 2010, when the Obama administration insisted that all insurance plans include contraceptive coverage, that was a little bit of that was kind of a flare up of questions about women. The campus rape debate, especially in 2011, also the Obama administration put out this thing famously called the Dear Colleague letter, in which they suggested that rape on campus was incredibly widespread and huge numbers of college women were being sexually assaulted, and we needed to do something about this. And then there were these fairly aggressive efforts on university campuses to have some kind of crackdown on that. So that was a moment that was like that. And then you young people here probably do remember the Me Too moment, right? Which to a certain extent followed on those same kinds of themes. And then the Women's March, all these women's marches that happened after Donald Trump was elected in the Capitol, but all over the place. So that was kind of a big spotlight moment for feminists. But really, all of these major sort of moments of the 21st century had primarily to do with sort of women's treatment in various sectors of society, whether they were adequately respected, whether we were too permissive of aggressive male behavior. They were sort of these soft cultural questions about whether women were being appropriately treated and whether we viewed them correctly. That doesn't mean that they're unimportant, right? But it means that there wasn't usually some hard question in law or policy that was being debated, like as in the case of, say, abortion, or whether or not it's permissible for a company to refuse to hire mothers, something like that, right? I mean, mostly we're sort of talking about kind of ground level questions about how people interact, not an obvious discrete social change that's being debated. Nobody really ever thought that sexual harassment was good, right? There were people out there saying, "Oh no, I like sexual harassment. Let's encourage employers to sexually harass women in the work." Nobody thought that, right? I mean, it was really just a question of, are we responding to it appropriately? And so, how bad a problem is it really? So I think in some ways, because the kinds of issues that were being debated didn't have that hard kernel of a particular debate in social change, conservatives in those periods, they tended to push back to some extent when they thought that things that were being proposed from the other side were too aggressive, right? They thought, oh, well, you know, these efforts to, so like in these campus efforts to end sexual harassment, you had these, I don't know, some courts or hearings or things for people who were accused of it, and they would say, well, we don't really think that the rights of people who are accused are being adequately respected. It seems like we're kind of, you know, railroading people on limited evidence. So they would complain about things like that. But again, there wasn't really like there was some hard issue here, like anybody thought that campus rape was good or sexual harassment was good. And then the whole thing was kind of turned around again by transgenderism, which really has, I think, transformed debates within the feminist world quite a bit, right? Because once transgenderism became a significant issue, suddenly we had spent all of these years talking about what protections are appropriate for women, and suddenly the question of who qualifies as a woman becomes this hugely controversial question. And now it becomes sort of a wedge issue among leftists, right? Now you have the leftists arguing with each other as some group of them say, no, we still really want these protections for women. And then others among them say, well, but why do you think that you can define that? Why do you think that these people are women and not those people? So you end up having that kind of debate among leftists. And that debate doesn't really end up involving conservatives a whole lot. You have some funny things like, you know, suddenly conservatives are like really interested in defending women's sports, which I find kind of entertaining. We didn't really care that much about women's sports before, I don't think. I don't remember that, but suddenly we're really excited about women's sports. Anyway, so there are some little funny moments, but really for the most part, I think conservatives find themselves kind of on the sidelines. But insofar as they're doing anything, they're kind of siding with the pro-women's protection feminists a little bit, right? Like they end up having some common cause with those people. So they're not super included, but insofar as they are, it's kind of a soft echo of support for some of the people that they actually used to consider opponents. But in this odd moment, I think it kind of set the stage for conservatives to have their own little war about how they think about it. Because since we weren't really, you know, the leftists are over there fighting among themselves, we kind of chime in a little bit, but for the most part, that's really kind of their own debate. So we end up having a little bit of our own argument about feminism. And within that argument, I think we've got basically a group of self-described anti-feminists and what I am here going to call sex realist feminists. I'll say more about that. Don't really love me, but you know. Yeah, so I mean, give all this background because I think the situation on the left with transgenderism and sort of traditional feminists, an older style of feminists fighting about women's issues, has to a certain extent set the stage for this, just because conservatives are like, and so we have like this sort of space to fight among ourselves. Here are some examples of new anti-feminist thinkers. I'm going to call them that. Many of them call themselves that. I don't think any of them would be offended. At the sort of like, you know, most popular level, least respectable, I don't know how you want to call it. Hannah Pearl Davis, you might have seen, she's a sort of Twitter, YouTube influencer. She's not a respectable person in conservative circles. I don't want you to get the impression that like good, respectable conservatives are going around quoting Hannah Pearl Davis, but she is, they're not, but she is out there. I mean, she does have actually quite a bit of influence in her way, right? She has billions of followers and this really popular YouTube channel. So as a popular expression of anti-feminism, yeah, I think someone like Hannah Pearl Davis is saying a lot of things. I put in quotes Peachy Keenan because it's not her name, but it's a columnist at American Mind. Scott Yenner is actually an academic political scientist. I know Scott Yenner, I know some. I don't know Peachy Keenan personally. I don't know him personally, but he writes on feminism. Helen Andrews, she writes at the American Conservative, and a woman named Carrie Gress. So these are all people you might encounter in certain places that I think typify that. And here are some of the characteristic anti-feminist claims, or the major tenets that I think all of the people that I just listed would agree. First of all, they like to say that feminism has, at all stages, been mistaken and cultural. There's a kind of total rejection of feminism that characterizes those things. Don't try to distinguish between the first wave and the second wave. They're all kind of doing the same thing, and it's not a good thing. Natural differences between men and women should be robustly recognized in both law and culture. Without that recognition, marriage and family life will continue to unravel, birth rates will go on declining, lots of social breakdowns will continue. And also they tend to say that conservatives of the past 2 decades have permitted massive cultural harm by their complicity. Conservatives in the past have not been aggressive enough. But all kinds of things fall apart. Now we really need to take it to the feminists in a serious way. I'm gonna just go do a couple of these quotes because I want to leave time for questions. What time do we have to end? Oh, okay. So I'll be quick. All right. So I'll just read. So this is a pretty characteristic quote from Carrie Gress. The seeds of present feminist ideas were sown even in the movement's earliest stages. Over the years, some have speculated that there was a major break in feminism from the early suffrage days between the first wave suffragettes and the second wave that arrived in the 1960s. A closer look reveals that feminism wasn't hijacked by the second wave, making it into something new. Rather, several founding ideas generated from socialist, egalitarian, and secular concepts in the late 1700s developed over time. So seeds of destruction were there from the beginning. The ideas broadened and grew from small seeds as feminism went from the French movement to the monolithic belief system accepted by a majority of Western. For the sake of time, basically Helen Andrews in her recent essay, you'll notice every quote I have here is from within the last year to 18 months. So I'm not digging things out of the deep depths. This is all stuff people have said very recently in print. So she basically is angry that conservatives did not fight back against the demand that companies have to hire mothers. She thinks it should be okay for companies not to hire mothers. Scott Yenner, I think I will read this one. Scott Yenner is kind of, he is interesting in a way. The changes affected by the anti-discrimination regime are significant. Under the old sexual constitution, this is sort of his term for what he sees as the social but sex and gender related cultural understandings, cultural and legal understandings of the early American period. Men dominated the public sphere and many workplaces. Women characteristically worked in feminine professions. Public opinion supported a woman's modesty. The sexual division of labor was accepted. Women were thought of as opaque, anxious, and mysterious. They were divided into marriageable good girls and unmarriageable bad girls. Men were heads of families and leaders of society. Such features had negative effects on both men and women. No settlement is perfect by any means, but it gave order to the lives of men and women and coordinated them in a complex dance that more often than not led to marriage, children, and at least a modicum of domestic happiness. Marriage showed men and women how their different interests could converge in a life well lived. This is from like 3 weeks ago. So this is not like ancient history. This is a very recent article by Anna. All right, I probably should blur over that other one from. So here are some sex realist. The game just doesn't sound very appealing to me. I don't know. It doesn't quite have a ring to it, but I promised that I was going to give this end on why I finally consented to be called a feminist. And basically this is kind of what it boils down to. As this war sort of erupts, I end up getting, okay, fine, I can participate in this. And this is the name that my friend Erica Bakiochi came up with for this camp. Because basically the idea is that there is an effort to understand what is just and good for and with respect to women in a way that takes seriously the reality of the body. That's why it's sex realist is the moniker that she chose. And at some point, you just have to kind of like agree to join the side that you're on, which actually that was that's what Midge Decker said. At some point you have to join the side that you're on. People keep characterizing you in a certain way and you're like, well, yeah, that's pretty much fair, I guess. So I guess you can call me a sex realist feminist, but here are some other, I'm not ashamed of it. I've just never loved the name exactly, but whatever, it's fine. Here are some other people in this. Erica Bakiochi, Mary Harrington, Louise Perry, Serena Giolito. You might encounter these people if you're reading. I put a question mark behind J.K. Rowling insofar as I don't think she has formally identified herself as a sex realist feminist, but I think she would fit the box for you. So you probably know some views. So here are the kind of defining things of sex realist feminism. Men and women are different in physiology, but share a rational nature, which means that women are suited to many pursuits. Women have been historically disadvantaged for reasons we can understand. But now the goal is to recognize women's full potential without going to war against nature or the human body. Motherhood and domestic labor are very important, but not the only contributions for which women are suited. And modern mores, especially as shaped by market forces, diminished respect for caregivers. This is a problem we should try to work with. It just in general, like the sex realist feminist camp, what's really going on in this dialectic mostly is you have these people on one side who will just say, we just need to absolutely reject all this feminist stuff. It's just led to evil. And then people over on the side that I'm kind of on, well, we continue to engage in this balancing act. There's a lot of goods here and we have to think about how we can realize them and so on and so forth. So, the second position is more nuanced. It's a little harder to be this sort of, like crazy flamethrower when you're constantly, well, okay, let's draw some distinctions. Like that's always what you're trying to say, but that is pretty much what people like me are usually trying to say. And I'll read this final quote and then I'm just going to take some questions. This is from Erica Bakiochi's article called Sex Realist Feminism, which was published at First Things, I think about a year ago, last April. It is a really good article. That's the one I sort of wished I had assigned you. It's hard to pick what things, but it does kind of lay out the position very clearly, I think. So if you're interested in this idea of sex realist feminism, I would recommend that you read the whole thing. But I'll just read her final quote and then flip to my last slide. So even if for Aristotle, both men and women are human, both basically rational, and therefore both designed to live virtuous lives, men and women differ fundamentally on the basis of their reproductive or biological function. So that's Aristotle's view, that the biological function was the primary differentiator. Indeed, it is precisely this function that differentiates the sexes. According to Aristotle, this difference is politically fundamental. Woman's childbearing function determines her distinctive domestic role by which she is perfected in virtue. Restricting women to this role, Aristotle writes in the Politics, is for the common good of the household and ultimately of the city. So that's Aristotle's argument, though he agrees that woman has a rational nature, though he kind of thinks she's a little less rational. Is basically what he indicates. But now moving on in the article, I'm skipping over some stuff just to give you the core of her argument. As an ACLU attorney, the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, not someone conservatives typically champion, but Erica likes at least some aspects of her thought, was chiefly responsible for convincing the Supreme Court in the early 1970s that laws that discriminate on the basis of sex were in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Ginsburg successfully argued that it was unreasonable for laws to classify all women according to the biological function of mother. or otherwise to judge individual women unfit for publicly minded activities to assumptions about their capacities as a class. Based on, okay. So here's her final conclusion. If Aristotle erred in disparaging the rational capacities of women by overemphasizing the bodily differences between male and female, Ginsburg's modern feminism errs in bracketing our bodies in the biological asymmetries of sex. So that's a kind of characteristic sex realist position. We have to take the body seriously, but women also have a rational nature, and we can't forget about that or treat that as something unimportant. I'll blur over the rest. Oh, and just get here in the war with the anti-feminists, and I did give you one of my own pieces, so you got a little bit of that dialectic. I think the real questions that people like me are usually asking the anti-feminists is, look, if we reject most of the arguments that were historically used to justify things like women voting or running for office or pursuing a wide range of opportunities, then are we going to furnish other arguments for that? Or are we just going to accept that women's suffrage and education, professionalism are a big mistake? Hannah Pearl Davis actually says women should not vote. That was a big mistake. Should not have let that happen. Right? So some people are willing to go there. I don't want to call people out if they're not formally on record as saying that, but I do know other people who I think that's doing suffrage is the same. That's a minority of people, but there are people. Other people, though, so Carrie Gress wouldn't accept that, I think. She would say, no, it's good for women to vote. And she has one line where she says that she was able to get a PhD. She has a PhD in philosophy and 5 kids, exactly like me. Kind of similar, but then also not. So anti-feminists don't all give the same answer. Some of them actually say, yes, we should not let women vote or have jobs. And others of them say, well, no, we should, but they just, the feminists went too far or something like that. But I think the real problem with the anti-feminist argument, I think, is that they haven't really filled in those gaps almost at all, right? I mean, unless you really want to go to the full direction of saying women shouldn't vote or be allowed to get degrees or something, then you need to provide other arguments that replace the ones that were in fact historically used if you want to make that case. And I don't think they've really done that very much. But I will end on that note and leave at least a little bit of time. Thanks.
So earlier you said that feminism has been misrepresented or misdefined or misexplained throughout history. In what about that has been misrepresented? Are there any examples of that?
Sorry, what was it I said exactly that you want unpacked here then?
You said that feminism has been misexplained or misdefined or repurposed, like to fit different arguments. I'm just trying to figure out what is feminism and how has it been manipulated to fit people's arguments over time.
Really think that it's very hard to give a clear-cut definition of what feminism is. That's one of the reasons why I, for a very long time, just declined to say whether I was a feminist or not. People associate lots of different things with the word feminism, and it's sort of very hard to come up with some list of central tenets that you would count as feminist. And one of the things that I think is worth noticing, right, is that the anti-feminists and people like, oh, I'm gonna slide on Phyllis Schlafly. That's why I didn't make it. Okay, well, people like Phyllis Schlafly, right, was an activist of the late 70s who militated against something called the Equal Rights Amendment, right? So it was sort of meant. It's actually very short. The text of the Equal Rights Amendment is like 2 lines or something. It was just, it's not permissible to discriminate on the basis of sex. It was meant as a constitutional amendment. And she started a grassroots movement that basically successfully prevented this from being ratified by the necessary 38 states. So she described herself as an anti-feminist. What does she mean? Well, she would still see herself as being pro-woman, right? The kinds of arguments that Phyllis Schlafly made, I don't necessarily think they were great arguments, but she definitely was making arguments that this measure will be bad for women. So she saw herself as pro-woman, but she also described herself as an anti-feminist, and what she meant was really just, I'm opposed to those people over there. Those people call themselves feminists, and I'm on the other side of them, so I'm gonna call myself an anti-feminist. But she certainly didn't think she was a misogynist, right? I mean, like, she thought she was a pro-woman person. So I think it's a little tough. I mean, if you're doing a history of feminism, then you know, typically we say, okay, the first wave was the suffragettes, and the second wave was, you know, sort of Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and these people that worked to get Roe v. Wade passed and tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. We think of that as the second wave. In the years since then, the whole thing has just sort of evolved into all kinds of strands. So I don't think if your question is there some like true core of feminism we can still decide what we're doing? Yes.
So an idea that you reiterated in your talk is the idea that women are rational beings who basically pursue ends and maximize themselves. It seems like a very individual virtue kind of thing. And I think that considering most societies throughout history have put societal virtues above individual virtues, do you have any particular argument that women maximizing themselves in this way is not an individual virtue, but a societal virtue?
Well, I mean, what is it that's individually oriented? Just saying that human beings have a rational nature doesn't seem like that is as such individualist, does it? I mean, if we're trying to figure out what kind of creatures human beings are, that doesn't seem like it as such pushes us in an individualist or more common good oriented direction. If we want to realize the common good in a society of human beings, we still have to understand what kinds of creatures are human beings, right? So I don't think that the mere claim that human beings are rational falls in any particular way on that one. But maybe that doesn't answer your question. What exactly is it that you're concerned about?
I was just concerned about the idea that like this specific idea of maximizing the self in the way that one conceives it seems that's what I'm saying. Like I'm doing me. I'm not working for the greater good. I'm working in like an Adam Smithian way. I'm working for myself. And through working purely for myself, I'm working for the greater good. Is that essentially what you're saying? Or
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Okay.
And I think that the entire ethos of the sex realist feminism is really pretty contrary to that. One of the things that's important in this way of thinking is we have to take seriously the body, but also questions of moral responsibility become extremely important, right? So for instance, this is why in the late 19th century, when you had these feminists who were very opposed to abortion, well, yeah, they cared about the lives of unborn children. They cared about the fact that they thought that many of these women had been sexually exploited by men, but they also really were deeply offended by the idea that women would not, it just seems to them that it was debasing women, right? For them to reject the burdens of motherhood, right? They thought that it's ennobling for women to step up to the plate and be good mothers. This is something we should want to do as morally responsible human beings. This is one of the things that sort of naturally follows from a true appreciation of the kinds of bodies that we have, right? And all human beings, in order to be virtuous, should try to figure out what kind of creature am I and how can I be that kind of creature well, right? In a good way, in a way that actually realizes the potential. But realizing that potential doesn't mean just me doing me, right? So when I say as a woman, I'm a married woman, I have the capacity to become pregnant. I've done that several times. The way of realizing that potential, the best way, right, is by then being a good mother to that child, right? So it's not just a me thing, right? Like the kind of being that I am draws me into relationships with other human beings, and I have to honor that potentiality in that way as well. So I think when we understand that we're rational beings, we are also relational beings, we're political beings, we're social beings. That's all part of our rational nature. And I think that should unfold naturally from our understanding of our human nature. I don't think it's intrinsically individualist. Yes.
What do you think some of the root causes are of this like puzzle sort of like womanhood, as you call it, that splits itself within the like right-leaning part of the country? What is it about this issue and like what caused it? When did it start? You know, what's the end?
Well, I said some of the things in the lecture about that, but I will also say that I think there is this kind of battle going on in the right now as well. I guess you could call it the liberalism, the anti-liberalism debate, or I mean, there's a lot of other strands on the right that are lateral to this debate about feminism. I think there are, so your more aggressively or enthusiastically illiberal or post-liberal, sometimes they like to call themselves, strands tend to be the most enthusiastic about these more aggressive forms of anti-feminism, right? Because they have a more rejectionist attitude towards our present social sphere in general. So it's not really that strange, but they're more willing to step in and say, our entire way of setting up, you know, relations between the sexes and families, and, you know, it's just so wrong all through. We really just need to reject enormous amounts of that. And then people that are less inclined in that direction, right, are more likely to say, well, yeah, I mean, we have some problems, but we still want to basically preserve a liberal order, right? Those people are less likely to be attracted to these more anti-feminist stances. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think that is another of the sort of tributaries. It's maybe a sub-theater, some larger debate on the right now about how rejectionist we want to be about our entire. And I mean, that also makes some sense, right? Because if you accept many of the premises of a liberal order or a broadly classically liberal society or something like that, it's just really hard to see how don't allow women to be full-fledged citizens, right? I mean, it seems pretty clearly to follow on anything like a broadly classically liberal orientation. I mean, there were broadly classically liberal societies that didn't do it, but it seems like it was they didn't give women the vote, for instance, but it seems like that was sort of natural development of unfolding those classically liberal. So it's not really strange that people who are more attracted to strong anti-feminist views also tend to be people who are not really that happy with the liberal order in general. Yes.
So first, I really like. I also agree with you in terms. I'd adhere to the tenets of the sex realist feminism. The name does feel a little like, because I love Erica's work and like I think Abigail Valley also would fit well into
Yes, she
all
would
of this as well. But my question is more about just like a historical question. When you talked about a debate in the 19th century on women's protections in the workplace, and I think like some of the threads I've seen through writings of Erica are talking about if we're going to be reckoning with the reality of our body in the workplaces, right? So increasing protections and supports of the natural cycles and things that occur for us, we need to understand how to do that in a way that we can think about policy as well. And so just for my own edification, do you have any sources that you'd recommend on that debate in the 19th century? Like who was talking, what were sort of some of the conclusions or hitch points? And then from your understanding now, where do you think we need to go, or what needs to be included in that conversation from a policy perspective?
So the 19th century debate, the person who's really covered this the most is Erica. And
Yeah.
her book, Erica Buck,
The Rights of Women.
her book, The Rights of Women, has an extended section on that. So she would be the person to go to first on that subject. I will, you didn't ask about this, but the other sort of lateral to that, the other 19th century stuff that I was talking about, the debates about abortion among there's a really good new book from a woman named Monica Clem, ALEM, specifically about that. It's called Pity for Evil. And she talks about all the debates that were happening about abortion in the 19th century, and then really describes a lot of the different social efforts that were made to care for women and to take in foundling babies, and like you're just trying to figure out all of the implications of, modernity is sort of crashing in on them after the Civil War, right? And you have large numbers of abandoned children, large numbers of women that can't care for their children, and they're trying to figure out the right response to that. It's a really interesting book. So if you're interested in those 19th century debates, I definitely recommend that. But on the question of where we should go now, this is a subject on which I'm pretty well informed, but I haven't got very definite views. I will say, if you're interested in the debates, one other source that I'll give you, and I'm one of the writers for this, or one of their featured, right? I don't know what my title is. It's called Fairer Disputations, and it is really basically conversations about questions in feminism. But it's basically it's a sex realist feminism site. Basically, it's people talking about sex realist feminism. It's a relatively new site. It's actually kind of interesting. When they started Fairer Disputations, and Erica and Serena Sigilito and these groups of people kind of started this, it's really kind of part of their idea is they wanted to get pro-life conservative women like Erica Bakiochi and me and people like that talking to leftists who also take the body seriously and see if we could have some interesting conversations. Because a lot of those people are also feeling kind of alienated, right? And so they're like, well, it's interesting for us to talk to each other and see what we agree on or something. That's kind of what they're trying to do over there. Actually, it's been pretty interesting, actually. So that'd be another place to look. Yes.
Just want to bring up J.K. Rowling and magic. Magic, as I see it pertaining to the liberal project. And so when we go back and we talk about women in the military, they shouldn't be in the military because they bear big, well, you know, what technology / magic has done is allowed women to work under a mountain in Colorado and kill people in foreign countries. Right? We've got all kinds of technologies that allow us to sort of just kind of do away with, I'm devil's advocating, but sort of do away with a lot of the problems that we've had and a lot of the debates we had with the role of women, the family, civil society. Is it maybe like the problem is not, you know, an incomplete or wrong feminism, but incomplete liberalism? Like the liberal project, insofar as that begets and is parallel with technological innovations, it's just a matter of time, isn't it, that women can be completely liberated? We don't have to recognize these sex realist differences. I said devil's advocating.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think now you're on Louise Perry's shirt, or Mary Harrington, actually. Mary Harrington wrote a book also about a year ago. Like I say, all this stuff is really big right now. Called Feminism Against Progress. That's very, and that's very interesting too. A lot of the stuff is really it's pretty worth it if reading some of these if you're interested. Mary Harrington is interesting because she was one of the people who came from the left and ended up having an unhappy youth, you might say, in which at some point in time she realized how totally alienated she was from her body, right? And realized that that was not actually a thing that she wanted, and then came back to something like I don't know if she would really call herself a conservative, but something that certainly aligns with a conservative view of things like the body. I think that one of the things that we are definitely seeing in our time is, look, I mean, sure, technology enables us to distance ourselves more from the body. That could continue to be the case, but I think we're seeing ample evidence that people don't really enjoy being distanced too much from their bodies, right? People have a kind of need to climb back into their bodies past a certain point because we are physically embodied beings, right? We are physically embodied. That's part of our identity. So I think one of the things that I myself think that one of the things that we're seeing with the transgenderism is there's many aspects to transgender. I think one of the things that's happening is we had this period in which it was very easy for young people when they reach this awkward stage where they're feeling so socially insecure and so on, to go online and find the perfect group of people. Like find some place where they sort of play with their personalities, play with their identity. You can be what you want here. If you get into some place where you're uncomfortable, you can just leave and go find some other place to be. It felt very freeing up front. That was certainly what Mary Harrington experienced. But then over time, then what ends up happening is you develop this personality that's kind of off here in the ether and isn't really connected to the life that you're living. You still have to eat and sleep and stuff like that, but like the person who eats in your table and sleeps in your bed doesn't seem that connected to whoever it is that you created for yourself online. And then we start realizing that there's a lot of problems that follow from that. I mean, one of the problems, of course, is just that it's much easier to be horrible to people that you only know online. It's much easier to walk away from them. It's much easier to betray them, you know, so you have that. I mean, you have like this entire, all of these like very unhappy, not healthy social relationships going on. But you also have this standpoint where, like this, learning to live within your body is not easy under any circumstances, right? Like going through adolescence, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, going through adolescence, going through puberty, learning how to deal with your newly sized body, learning how to deal with all of the natural consequences of eating junk food all the time and not sleeping enough. Like learning to live in your body is hard. So when you help people to do that less and less, right, by spending all their time using technology or screens to have their real lowest point of their life someplace totally apart from their body, then you end up finding a lot of people who are really lost and confused and alienated and don't really even know exactly what's wrong with them, but they do know that they feel very scattered, right? So yeah, I mean, technology can help us to get further away from our bodies, but we may find that like
One more. Right? Any more? Haven't heard from the ladies. Sorry. Not enough. We have another hour. So why don't we say thank you to